I think I'll take my tie off and get ready for it.
Sorry. And it will have occurred to everyone here, including you, that I'm not Kerry O'Brien, so it's not my role to try and trip you up in any way, nor to ask the questions that I think conventional journalists ask. I want to use this opportunity to probe some of the
Sure.
deeper issues, let's say, to do with this election and this country and this planet, but mainly this election. The first, and let me say something personal first. I haven't voted Green in the lower house ever, I think, although I think last time I did vote Green in the Senate. I will this time be voting Green in both houses. And the reason is, and I think there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands who are going to do so, and I have many reasons for that, but the overwhelming one is a really profound dismay at the failure of the two or three major parties to cope with climate change. I don't want, you've said a lot about that. I want to ask you something else to reflect on Australia in a way and the party system. Why do you think as a country, but also the major parties, have failed so dismally, perhaps more dismally even than the United States? Why cannot the major parties, and in a way perhaps even the country, come to terms with this profound human challenge?
Well, I can't give a comprehensive answer to that. I know that I'm a Green because I agreed with the great German Green Petra Kelly a few decades ago when she said about the established parties, and she'd worked on Robert Kennedy's campaign in the United States for president, and she'd worked with the Social Democrats in Germany, and said they put on their green spots in opposition and they shed them in government, and you can't change them from inside. That was my advice, by the way, to my friend Peter Garrett before he made the, I think, fateful decision to go with Labor. But I think the power of, we have a very concentrated media. The Australian newspaper, for one, has written 200 editorials mentioning the Greens since in the last decade, and all but 4 of them have condemned the Greens, and the other 4 have begun with, we can't believe we're saying this, and we have an exclusion clause. We agree with the Greens, but it's for, with some embarrassment that the paper's done so. Now, there's very limited discourse in the public arena, but I think more important than that is the secret hand of the lobbying groups. Across from Parliament House is the big glass houses for the mining industry, the National Association of Forest Industries, the big food corporations. Coles and Woolies are there. They do the farmers in every time. They even scuttle plastic bag, getting rid of plastic bags. And we saw it when Kevin Rudd was effectively and so swiftly removed because the miners came to town. It's a lobbying industry that needs to be brought out into the open. We would legislate to have all lobbyists not only required to register, but each time they visit all members of Parliament, include backbenchers, to have that recorded and the topic that they spoke about recorded. Because I saw Penny Wong said in a article in the Australian last year that she'd seen every coal mining company in Australia. Well, I went down to the desalination plant on the Bass Coast here, where people were desperately trying to stop that going ahead. And I won't go into the arguments for that, except the price of water in Melbourne will go up as a result, but Penny Wong refused to see them. So if you're a community group, even with a Labor government, you're on the outer. But if you're from the big corporation, you're on the inner, and we need to do something if we're going to have fair discourse at where the decisions are made in Parliament to redressing that.
You said you were happy about the election, and I can well understand why you are, because it's very possible that we'll come to think of this election as a sea change in Australian politics, where the Greens become more than a 7 or 8% party and let's say a 13 or 15% party, which would make, I think, a huge difference. So it is, I can see it might be your moment. We'll find out on August the 21st. On the other hand, many of us, even taking that into account, have found this election campaign peculiarly dismal. And in a way, I think, dismal in a way that I can't remember any previous campaigns. And the reason, and this is, I suppose I'm just asking whether you agree with this and what you think about it. The reason seems to me twofold. I don't mean the soap opera, I mean the policy area. Twofold. One is the non-issues that keep on being discussed. You mentioned one, the boats. Whatever one might think about that, it's such a small issue and it seems to me that most of the refugees who've come have been great citizens, and it seems not only a small issue but a non-problem. But even bigger one maybe is this endless talk about our problem with debt when we have 6% of GDP. And yet that is, if you listen to the Liberal campaign, that's dominating. I was talking to Paul Johnson before, I don't think I've heard one word about universities. I don't think I've heard one word about the war in Afghanistan. We've hardly heard anything sensible about climate change. We've heard from you about Denticare, so obviously an important matter, in actually the eloquent way you put it in your talk about why it matters to the poorer citizens to not have dental care. Disability has hardly been discussed, and so on and so forth. What's gone wrong with the national conversation? And I suppose also, can the Greens change that and show non-issues to be non-issues and make the real issues in this very wealthy country, but make them real again?
It's a very good question, and I don't know what the future holds, but I do think there is some parallel between the rise of the Greens, and this nation leads in this regard in 2010, and the rise of the Labor Party at exactly this time last century. The Whigs and Tories had been in there talking about free trade and protectionist, but the social dimension was left out in an age where there was a huge disparity between the haves and the have-nots and the workers and their rights and the people who were making money out of the Industrial Revolution. And Labor rose. It had lots of troubles, but it had a social conscience which was missing from the earlier discourse. I think now the ecological integrity of a planet which is being overtaxed, and which, if everybody had the consumption rate we've got, we'd need 3 planets, not one, is screaming out. But the old tapes are being run by, Machiavelli said 600 years ago, if you want to change the world, I'm paraphrasing here, get ready to be dropped on from a great height by those who've got the power and the money. And that's playing itself out now. Look at the power of the coal miners. But, I think the other thing is with the collapse of the A, carbon tax, and B, the mining tax, super profits tax, as part of both parties began by saying we won't spend any money in this election campaign. The ball and chain was self-applied to the foot. So the discourse has not been about a vision for the nation's future based on our real wealth, including our ecological wealth. It's been about a minimalist view of what you could offer on any given day. So the Prime Minister this morning's announced that unemployed people can get a $6,000 grant to go to another place to get employment, but will lose all those will lose access to future unemployment if they don't abide by certain rules. And it's got a certain Howardian ring about it, which is very, very troubling. I think that power of the big end of town, if you like, has compressed the political discourse, and they're not prepared to break out of it, but we are. I mean, we're free to. We're not a faction, we're not a preference machine, we're not a ginger group, we are an alternative. And if we don't carry this through, someone else will rise. Well, it's pretty obvious. There are 14 million people displaced in Pakistan at the moment with all its food lands, its prime food lands, destroyed. We've offered 10 million so far, but it's not in the political discourse. Afghanistan. I see the US says, well, it can't take helicopters out of Afghanistan to get people off the flooded roofs in Pakistan next door because of the war with the Taliban. I wonder if anybody has said to everybody, let's at least try and get a cessation of hostilities while we deal with the 14 million people displaced next door. but the thinking's not at that level, and it needs to be. And you know, I don't think you've got to be Einstein to apply some human, compassionate, common sense ideas into the political firmament, but you'll get some stick along the way, and we know about that, but that's always been part of human history.
I mean, just to take up that from a slightly different angle, many of the things you suggest domestically cost money. The dental scheme, which I profoundly support, costs money. I think it's a scandal that mental health is not dealt with more generously in as rich a country as this. I think people who are looking after those with disabilities and their lives are dominated by it, don't have any help, etc., etc., and there are many more things. The unwritten rule of contemporary politics is that you can't increase tax. I mean, you have to get money from somewhere. I'd be in favour of much higher income and indirect tax, not only mining tax. But do you think it's true that if you, I don't know what you've said in detail about such things, I should know, but I don't, but if you advocated clearly increases for the upper parts of society, increases in direct tax, increases in GST, or whatever, would that be lethal for the Greens, do you think? You can talk about mining tax, but that, in a way, the Rudd government started that.
No, it won't be, Robert, but what happens in an election campaign is that the Greens get outspent. And the attack ads have started in the ACT because Lynn Hatfield Dodds, who's the former CEO of ACOS and Uniting Charities and Citizen of the Year, is standing for the Greens. And the Abetz and Abbott team can see that if she wins a seat in the ACT, that there goes their chance of dominance, because they only need to pick up one more seat somewhere else, and they'll dominate the Senate, and the Greens will be over there, sidelined. So a huge amount, and tack ads have started to appear. Now, we have not been able to match that. We'll do better this time. But, you know, the people, advertising works. And my view is that there should be public funding of political parties, as in Canada, and there should be truth in advertising. But when I moved for truth in advertising in the Senate a couple of months ago, both the big parties voted it down. They don't want to be restricted by having to be truthful in what you're putting forward. And so we're getting an undermining of the public debate by a very potent and nasty way, which works. Negative advertising works. We'll see a lot more of it in the next few weeks. Maybe if we put some... Bob Hawke tried to get rid of television advertising and the High Court ruled it down because it was against free speech. But let's get some fair parameters into it, and let's get some fairness into the ability of everybody to have a say, including community groups, unions, business. But at the moment, it's the biggest spender who gets the biggest result, and that is inherently undemocratic. One person, one vote, one value. We're a long way short of it. And so we need to be looking at improving the basic laws which understrap the democratic system in Australia, which includes proportional representation in the House of Representatives, by the way. If we had that, there'd be 10 Greens there at the moment. But we don't have it. And you say you'll vote this time for the House of Reps. People think it's a wasted vote, but in fact it's double value. If you vote for the Greens candidate and she or he doesn't get up, your vote goes over as a whole vote to the next party of your choice. I think we have a very big blight on the purchase of democracy, on the purchase of people's votes, and we have to be able to redress that through some pretty strong democratic laws which will create a furor from those who already have the power, as Machiavelli said.
Another difficult question. The way I look at Australian politics and society is to see there being a values divide between that group that are known as the battlers, whatever that means, and a group that's known as the elites, whatever that means. But it seems to me, when thinking about things, particularly since the mid-1990s, that the Greens have done well and are growing in the inner city area, amongst professionals, amongst students, amongst the educated, amongst reasonably well-heeled people. I don't think you've penetrated, unless I am mistaken, the group that are known as the battlers, the people in the outer suburbs or in the regional towns. So the question is, can you break through into the non-inner city areas?
Yeah, I was talking to Jonathan Dickey, who's our candidate in Mackay, in central Queensland, population 85,000. Well, that electorate extends up to Townsville, coal capital of the world, 79 ships waiting off the port. They want to put more money, as I said earlier, into coal transport, and there's no public transport in the city. Private buses, first one starts at 7:30 and the next is 8:30. And the point in what you say is true, but what's happening here is that more and more people, yes, the Greens have a bigger tertiary educated component of our voter base and more professionals, including teachers, nurses and so on, if you look at the demographic. But going back to your earlier question, there's a pretty big generosity there, and we have the strongest policies. For example, in industrial relations, we get rid of the Australian Building and Construction Commission, which cuts down international law and picks on, in a pretty grotesque fashion, one group of workers in this country. Howard legislation that should have gone west in this last period. And also rights for example, Rachel Seward negotiated when the Labor got rid of work choices to bring in a law which enabled the parents of disabled children to have flexible work hours. And we now want to extend that to all carers, because carers are estimated to be a $30 billion contributor to the economy, people looking after disabled folk at home or elderly parents or whatever. And it's not hard to do that, but the amazing thing for me, and it gives me great optimism, is that yes, I think we have a above average voter base in terms of income, but they're a compassionate voter base. And we don't get howls of outrage from Green members about wanting to get a $30 increase in the age pension after 13 years in which the Howard government did nothing there. We don't get concern about levying a carbon tax, which might put up power prices, because across the board all the polls show people are prepared, as long as it's fair for everybody, to take a small burden now to save the next generation from a 6 to 20% hit on their economy if we don't tackle climate change. People are pretty wise out there. There's more intelligence in the general electorate, while there is in an average primary school about climate change, there is around the cabinet table in Canberra, where they're corralled by these big power lobbyists. So no, we have a great deal of faith in the fair go, the real ethic of fair go in this country. And our experience has been that where we've stood up for industrial relations, for poorer people, for boat people, the much stigmatised boat people and so on, our voter base grows. And that gives me great optimism about the future.
And you think you can break into a different kind of demographic?
Well, I think we have. We've overtaken the Nationals in the bush because people out there can see climate change happening to them. The National Party has become the coal party. And we're into food security, biosecurity. The Fin Review editorial 2 weeks ago, let's get rid of biosecurity because it's in the way of the free market. Excuse me. Preventing pests and the further invasion of croplands in Australia due to reducing the biosecurity at airports and seaports and so on. No, you don't do that. That's not good economic management. And I just think the big parties have become too frightened of the lobbyists at the expense of backing a much more important entity, which is the intelligence and the compassion abroad in the wider Australian community. And that's where I and my fellow Greens put their faith.
I just have a couple more questions. One is, maybe you can't answer, given that this is not a private meeting, but nevertheless, I'd be interested in if you can. Do you think the Greens are treated fairly by the media? Or do you feel that you're up against it because of the nature of the Australian media?
Look, I think like all changes, if you said, are we getting 12% coverage in the media at the moment? No, we're not. If you look at the package, the national package on ABC each night, I think I've appeared twice since the election got underway, or 3 times. But every night the other political leaders are there. But we don't mind. Really, if you get to grizzling about your coverage, and I see an article in today's Herald Sun about people who are going to vote Green this time. There's a change occurring, Robert, and it's because we've put in the hard yards, we've put in the work, and the media is changing. And it's very, very important that we are getting scrutiny and that we are being asked the hard questions. That's a sign of maturation. No, we've in the past had a hard time in the media. But every time we get a bit worried about that, I go back and have a look at what they said about the suffragettes and funded in the House of Lords and in the Times and so on. How on earth could you run an economy if women had a say in it? Was the standard stupidity and buff-headedness of commentators who were running the media just 100 years ago. Well, a little bit of negativity in the media about the Greens now. When you put it into proportion, getting rid of slavery, how could you run an economy? And they thundered that there would be a trade loss in the British Empire if they got rid of slavery. 1809, read the transcript in the British Parliament, and the trade will all go to the US, where they did have slavery. And so the trade exposed industries were going to be hurt. They're the same ones that in this age of climate change, the big parties want to compensate in Australia. Even the Greens have that built into our carbon tax proposal. But no, history repeats itself, and if you're a bit discomforted about getting a hard time of it, just go and look what's happening elsewhere in the world or what's happened in the past. But look, the suffragettes didn't live to see, most of them didn't live to see the fantastic outcome. We now take it for granted. And I'd like to think in ecological terms of the greening of the global population, you know, have a public census about a global referendum tomorrow about diverting 6% of the $1 trillion being spent on armaments this year to ensure that every child on the planet had clean water, food in her or his belly and a school to go to, and I know what the result would be.
My last question. An acquaintance or friend of mine, Guy Pearce, says of the Greens that they're more liberal, and he means small L liberal, than the Liberal Party, and more Labor than the Labor Party, as well as being, I think, greener than the others. And I suppose my question is quite a difficult one. Sometimes I think what the Green Party is doing, or perhaps has to do, is to inherit 2 traditions. One is the tradition of small L liberalism, particularly in the area of civil liberty. The other is the tradition of what I call social democracy, in the area of, as it were, what we Australians call the fair go. Do you see it that way, that you can in a way be the inheritor of traditions but add, as it were, the green dimension? Or do you see your party as, you know, essentially an environmental party with small add-ons in the areas of small L liberalism and social democracy?
No, I was talking with a gentleman from the Age about this morning when I ran into the United Tasmania Group, the first Greens party in the world. After I went to Tasmania, they just formed a month before I got there in 1972, after the flooding of Lake Pedder. They had this ethic, and here was equality for women. Now, it's a bit hard to remember how loaded everything was against women back then. We've got a way to go, but there it was. Recognition of Indigenous Australians, protection of farmlands, stopping this nascent then wood chipping industry which was going to destroy, and across the board, and an economic ethic of a fair go for people who were in poverty. So right from the outset, it's dovetailed. As an environmentalist and former Presbyterian, I found this very pleasant to see that a compassionate ethos towards people, a fair go, in society, dovetailed in with an ecological common sense. And but Robert, the thing the big parties are missing is that constraint. I came onto the planet in 1944. There were 22.7 billion people. Melbourne's population had just crossed 1 million, but was less than 1.5 million. Now there's 7 billion people, at least there will be next year, and by the time many of you folk are my age, there'll be 10 billion. And yet, as I said, less farmland every morning. And but the aspiration of the rapidly growing economic units in Africa, in India, as we all know about China, is to consume like we do, and it's not there. And we have to have the intelligence to be able to apportion the riches of this planet so that we simply give security back into the future and are able to give our grandchildren the ability to look back on us and say, you thought about us and you were wise enough to change course when the course of free-rein consumerism of the 20th century was straight at a brick wall. And we're turning, it is like a bit like turning the Queen Mary. We are turning the ship around. I don't know, I sometimes worry that we will become complacent, that we will become too confined by the parameters of public debate, particularly the media debate. But I'm very, very worried about that. I read about it, I look about it, I see the global scientists, hundreds of Nobel Prize winners, saying we must tackle climate change. And Maggie Thatcher said in 1989, every year we delay on climate change, the cost of dealing with it goes up. Now, I found something I agree with Maggie Thatcher on. But they're not listening in Canberra. And this is a crisis, not just for humanity, but this is the biggest this is the International Year of Biodiversity, and the biggest extinction rate in human history will be this year, and it's going to be worse next year. And here we are destroying forests. Here we are having greenies who lock themselves onto bulldozers, having to go to court to try and argue this case, because the Brumby government or the Gillard government and worse still, the Abbots opposition wants to keep funding the destruction of those forests. It's, when you think about it, it's the getting of wisdom. That's what the Greens are about, and we're not shy about that. And once you know about it, you can't change. It doesn't matter how many Australian editorials they might throw at us. Thank you very much.